and together all 12 of us founded the Ocean Decade Heritage Network as a way to try to get people within our own community aware of what the Ocean Decade is, and also as a way to try and get people within that marine science community to understand the contribution of cultural heritage. So we have this two-pronged approach.
And I guess the latter is the difficult one, as you've been hinting at earlier. I mean, okay, there's the network and various meetings, I presume, but I mean, how do you bring visibility and voice to heritage within the context of the Ocean Decade?
So a lot of it involves meeting people and going out and participating simply in a lot of different types of conferences and fora. So I spend time, as well as being a part of the cultural heritage. We're going to have our usual circuit, our cycle of conferences and meetings at different levels, but also participating with other colleagues in, I would say, more marine sciencey type of conferences. So going to, there's a huge one called Oceans. There's also for example, we've been fortunate to be able to get a seat at the table for the last 4 COP, the big climate meetings. So it's talking with different groups of people at kind of a higher, I don't want to say a higher level, but a top-down level. So we focus on very much from ODHN side of seeing that, well, if we're going to affect change, we have to do it also from a very strong practitioner level, but also from a policy level. So it's kind of it's called high level. I put that in air quotes. I'm using my fingers here because I don't necessarily like the term, but it is high level in the sense that it's national and international, intergovernmental level working. And so trying to get into the right types of meetings, get the right types of dialogue going in the sense of how can we at an international and national level have changes in policy and governance and management to simply change the way that we approach the ocean, creating this kind of, I'd say, holistic, very interdisciplinary perspective of science is something that to us includes not just including hard data based on kind of these hypotheses, but also data that's not so numbers driven. So trying to put on the same level traditional ecological knowledge is a big driver. There's a lot of data that's not necessarily written down or measurable in any kind of graph, an XYZ chart, but it's something that has a long time frame and can really help us answer some questions about changes and reaction, resilience, and deep time.
No, absolutely, and because it's obvious that we can learn from practices, but I mean, I imagine the challenges of actually shifting mindsets is quite large. I mean, what do you find is one of the biggest challenges then, and how do you try and overcome it? I mean, persuading people that these traditional knowledge, for example, is important. I mean, it must be hard.
I think I've mentioned this to you before, is that I feel like I spend a lot of my time trying to change people's minds. And that's not something that I ever thought I would be doing. But I would say on the individual level, when I talk to a lot of marine scientists, once we're able to give really good concrete examples we have a lot of case studies that we're able to cite and say, this is how this data set is contributing to understanding what's going on, for example, in resilience to impacts of coastal erosion or impacts of tsunamis 2,000, 3,000 years ago, or this is what, certain species that were fished 3,000 years ago, this is how the size has decreased, this is how the catch has decreased over time. Once these examples are presented, I see like little light bulbs going off because it makes sense. The data is there. It's just that in a lot of cases, as we all are, we're so focused in our own field that we don't necessarily reach out to anything adjacent and see what's going on there. And everyone has that challenge in terms of time and focus. So it's not any kind of willful ignorance. It's simply not being made aware. And fortunately, we've been able to be in fora where we can demonstrate that necessity, and we see lights going off, and that's very helpful. It's harder to change, I mentioned policy earlier, it's harder to change the kind of grind, the machine of policy, and that's really the main challenge. And so that's why we've also decided that, well, if you're going to start top down with policy, one way to meet in the middle is try and do some very demonstrable activities from the bottom up, and try and meet somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a really good point you make about, our little silos and thinking about our subjects and not extending those thought processes and looking at other data. But it sounds like you're making some real progress with that. I mean, and also, didn't you secure some funding for a sort of subgroup?
So we were fortunate early on in the first call. We applied to be part of the UN Ocean Decade, and our program is called the Cultural Heritage Framework Program, CHFP, and we were one of the first, I think, about 70 endorsed programs. So under that program, it's kind of, we can have activities and projects associated with us that are also endorsed. And to date, we're still the only, this was back in 2021, we're still the only program that has cultural heritage in it or addresses cultural heritage.
And how long does this run for, the framework? Until the end of the decade, or?
Well, that's what we plan. It's conceived to run until 2030, but we hope, and we are discussing that now, how can we have a life after 2030? Because the 2030 agenda, those 17 goals, they don't stop. There's going to be also new goals that are coming, and there's rumors that there's actually going to be a specific goal on cultural heritage, and that's very interesting for us. Our ears are listening very closely to what's happening within the UN. So we also see, because of how people are now approaching ocean heritage, as we call it, or we like to call it, that there is a need. It's making sense for so many people to really approach the ocean as an interdisciplinary space, and given how people address through ocean literacy the maritime space, but also how we study it, how we train people through academia, how we address it through publications. This, I think, is all starting to go towards a more interwoven future, because there's certainly, I think it's very demonstrable that the siloing effect that we talked about earlier between disciplines, that doesn't really make sense, and it's not an economical solution, and it's also not management wise, I think, going to be the way forward. So this is going to affect how policy in the end is going to be written.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I mean, the other thing it makes me think about is also perception of cultural heritage and marine cultural heritage, because there are a huge variety. So it's not just, because you were talking about education and that sort of thing, but actually the bottom up and the top down and all the bits in between. So there's lots of mind changing, as you said at the very beginning, to be done. But it sounds like you're doing a really excellent job. So, and I've learned loads actually talking to you, which I genuinely didn't know. So I really appreciate you finding the time and flagging what the Ocean Decade Heritage Network is up to.
Great, thank you.
Many thanks, Athena. Extremely important work that the network is doing, bringing visibility and value to maritime cultural heritage and within the wider ocean science arena. Athena also mentioned the Cultural Heritage Framework programme that the network helped set up.